It was the 1990s in Melbourne, Australia, a city pulsating with life, culture, and, beneath its surface, a dark underbelly of crime. This was a time when the streets whispered of a violent era that would later be etched into history as the Gangland War. A wave of highly publicized murders swept through the city, targeting known or suspected criminals. The media sensationalized it, but for those living it, it was a time of fear, betrayal, and bloodshed. At the center of this storm was a man whose unassuming baby face masked a ruthless killer. His name was Carl Williams, and his reign of terror would leave an indelible mark on Melbourne's criminal underworld. But how did a cheerful boy from a working-class suburb become one of the most notorious figures in Australian crime? And what was his ultimate fate? Stick around, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Carl Anthony Williams was born on October 13, 1970 in Broadmeadows, a working-class suburb in North Melbourne known for its struggles with poverty and crime. He was the second son of George and Barbara Williams, a close-knit family that didn't have much but held on to each other tightly. Carl's older brother Shane was someone he idolized. While Shane was deeply attached to their father, Carl was his mother's boy, cheerful, active, and full of life. But as Carl grew older, things began to change. He struggled in school, gained weight, and found himself drifting. After leaving school, he took up work as a laborer, but his brother Shane had chosen a different path, one that led straight into the heart of Melbourne's criminal underworld. Shane fell into heroin addiction and became skilled in theft and burglary. Carl watched, learned, and out of loyalty, began to step into that shadowy world to support his brother. At first, Carl's role was small, acting as a lookout for Shane during burglaries. But one fateful night, Carl was caught by the police. They weren't interested in him, though. They'd wanted information on Shane. Allegedly, they beat Carl, trying to pressure him into betraying his brother. But Carl stayed silent, refusing to give them what they wanted. This act of loyalty marked a turning point. From there, Carl's involvement in crime escalated rapidly. By 1994, Carl had advanced to drug trafficking, and he quickly made a name for himself in Melbourne's criminal circles. He became known as the new kid on the block, a rising star in the underworld. It wasn't long before he crossed paths with the infamous Moran family, a name synonymous with Melbourne's criminal history. The Morans were a force to be reckoned with. Lewis Moran, the family patriarch, was a prominent figure in the city's criminal scene. His wife, Judy Moran, had two sons, Mark and Jason, who were making their own mark in the underworld. Carl initially maintained a good relationship with the family, but a minor incident would soon spark a rift that would have deadly consequences. One of the Moran gang members had been abusing his wife, Roberta. When Carl found out, he offered her support and kindness, eventually convincing her to leave her husband and start a new life with him. In 1997, Carl and Roberta became a couple, a move that the Morans saw as disrespectful. But this was just the beginning of the tension. That same year, Carl's brother Shane tragically died of a heroin overdose. For Carl, Shane's death was a turning point. Ironically, he turned to drug manufacturing as a business, teaming up with Daniela Maguire, who owned a pill press. Together, they began producing ecstasy, and by 1999, Carl had his own recipe. But this move put him in direct competition with the Morans. To keep an eye on him, they entered into a joint venture with Carl. For a while, Carl and Mark Moran became good friends, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Carl was selling his products at lower prices, undercutting the Morans. Then several containers of chemicals went missing, and a large batch of products was destroyed. Suspicion fell on Carl. Jason and Mark confronted Carl, roughing him up and pistol whipping him. Carl swore he wasn't responsible, but the final blow to their relationship came when Mark began dating Danielle Maguire, the woman who had been helping Carl with his ecstasy operation. Mark demanded access to the pill press, and Carl, furious, sabotaged it to make it look like wear and tear. The Morans weren't fooled. They discovered Carl's sabotage and called a meeting. The discussion turned heated, and Mark struck Carl on the head with a wooden plank. Jason then drew a pistol, aiming it at Carl's head as he lay wounded on the ground, begging for his life. Mark urged Jason to shoot him, but Jason hesitated. Instead, he fired a single shot into Carl's stomach and left him for dead. Miraculously, Carl survived. He managed to walk himself home to his parents' house, where he tried to downplay the severity of his injury. He took a shower and attempted to treat the wound himself, but after a few hours, he grew dizzy and weak. His parents rushed him to the hospital, where an X-ray revealed the bullet still lodged in his body. This event marked a turning point, intensifying the already simmering hostility between Carl and the Moran family. Carl wasn't just angry, he was consumed. He wanted Mark, Jason, and their father, Louis Moran, dead, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. But revenge isn't a simple task, especially when your enemies are as powerful as the Morans. Carl began gathering every piece of information he could about the family, their movements, their routines, their weaknesses. With his growing connections in Melbourne's underworld, he soon had the intel he needed. His first target? Mark Moran. Carl saw Mark as the brains of the family, the strategist, and therefore the greater threat. He believed that if he took out Jason first, Mark would stop at nothing to retaliate, and likely succeed. However, Carl's plans were put on hold by an unexpected setback. The police raided his home, uncovering a massive drug operation. Inside, they found a pill press, powdered amphetamine, and evidence of a thriving criminal enterprise. On November 25, 1999, Carl and his father, George Williams, were arrested. The police seized over $20 million worth of drugs, and both men faced the possibility of lengthy prison sentences. But the justice system moves slowly. On January 22, 2000, Carl and George were granted bail. This period of freedom stretched for years, giving Carl the opportunity to continue his criminal activities and his quest for revenge. Now out on bail and more determined than ever, Carl began plotting in earnest. He acquired 2 shotguns and waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came when he learned that Jason Moran had been arrested and was in jail. With Jason temporarily out of the picture, Carl turned his attention to Mark. On June 15, 2000, Carl arrived at Mark's home, dressed in all black and armed with a concealed shotgun. He lured Mark outside with a phone call, pretending to be someone else. Mark, feeling invincible in his own territory, ignored repeated warnings from his wife and stepped outside. As he walked out of range of his home security system, Carl ambushed him. The shotgun blast was swift and deadly. Mark Moran was dead. The news spread like wildfire through Melbourne's underworld. It didn't take long for the Moran family to realize that Carl Williams was behind the murder. But Carl wasn't hiding. In fact, he wanted recognition. He made sure word got out that he was the one who had taken down Mark Moran. With this act, the war between Carl Williams and the Moran family was officially declared. When Jason Moran was granted temporary release from prison to attend his brother's funeral, he vowed to kill Carl. But from behind bars, Jason's options were limited. He hired a fearsome hitman named Benji Veniamin to carry out the job. Benji was known for his ruthlessness, and Jason trusted him to get the job done. Benji successfully infiltrated Carl's inner circle, earning his trust and becoming one of his trusted gang members. But something unexpected happened. Instead of carrying out the hit, Benji grew close to Carl. He was charmed by Carl's personality and ultimately switched sides, betraying the Morans by not fulfilling the contract. Meanwhile, Carl's legal troubles continued. He was arrested on drug trafficking charges and jailed from May 19, 2001 to July 17, 2002. But upon his release, Carl wasted no time resuming his quest for revenge. However, his time in jail had weakened his control over his criminal empire. Competitors had risen in his absence, threatening his business and his power. One of these competitors was a man known as Nikolai the Russian Radev. Born in Bulgaria in 1959, Nikolai had arrived in Australia in 1980 and quickly built a reputation for ruthlessness. He extorted associates, threatened police officers and their families, and was even suspected of murdering 2 detectives. By 2003, Nikolai was trafficking large quantities of heroin into Melbourne, posing a direct threat to Carl's operations. Carl knew he had to act. Using his charm and business savvy, he manipulated Nikolai into a vulnerable position under the guise of striking a lucrative deal. On April 15, 2003, Carl sent Benji to a prearranged meeting with Nikolai. As the Russian drove his $100,000 Mercedes to the meeting, Benji intercepted him at a junction. Leaping out of his car, Benji opened fire, unloading a barrage of bullets into Nikolai. The attack was so brutal that media reports later described Nikolai's body as resembling Swiss cheese. Karl had discovered a new strategy. By paying others like Benji to carry out the killings, he could eliminate his enemies while keeping his own hands clean. But his thirst for revenge wasn't yet satisfied. 3 years had passed since Jason Moran had shot him, and Karl still wanted Jason dead. Consumed by this desire, Karl put out a hit on Jason. Jason, aware of the contract on his life, became increasingly cautious. He moved discreetly and hired a full-time bodyguard named Pascal. But as we'll see, even the most careful plans can unravel in the brutal world of the Gangland War. Karl had received a crucial piece of intelligence. Every Saturday morning, Jason would attend his children's football training. It was a routine, a moment of normalcy in a life otherwise steeped in violence. For Karl, it was the perfect opportunity to strike. On Saturday, June 21, 2003, Jason Moran spent over an hour cheering on the kids, oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. As the training session ended, Jason and his bodyguard, Pascal, loaded Jason's twins and several other children, including his nephews, into a blue Mitsubishi van. The kids were buckling themselves in, laughing and chatting, when a killer approached. Victor Brinkat, Karl's hired gunman, walked up to the driver's side window, a shotgun in hand. Without hesitation, he fired directly into Jason's face. The blast was deafening, and brain matter splattered across the vehicle, and across the terrified children. Victor then pulled out a revolver and shot Pascal multiple times before fleeing the scene. 2 men were dead, and a van full of traumatized children was left behind. The brutality of the killing shocked Melbourne. To murder a man in front of children was a new low, even for the Gangland War. But for Karl, it was a victory, one he was eager to celebrate. That night, he reportedly told his wife, Roberta, to wear her best dress. They were going out to celebrate. With Jason Moran dead, Karl felt unstoppable. He had built immense power, wealth, and loyalty within his gang, and he had developed a taste for eliminating those who crossed him. His next target was Willie Thompson, a former associate who owed Karl approximately $900,000. Karl knew Willie couldn't repay him, so he decided it was time for retribution. On July 21, 2003, 39-year-old Willie Thompson left the Extreme Jiu-Jitsu and Grappling Club on Waverley Road in Chadstone. As he got into his car, 2 vehicles rushed him. Karl's henchman, Andrew Benji Veniamin, ambushed Willie, shooting him dead at close range before fleeing the scene. This marked the 4th murder orchestrated by Karl, or at least carried out under his orders. Up until this point, law enforcement had largely kept their distance from the Gangland War, viewing it as an internal affair among criminals. But that was about to change. One of the bullets fired during Willie's execution had missed its target and come dangerously close to hitting a bystander. This near miss prompted the police to create a task force dedicated to ending the deadly gang wars. But Karl wasn't done. He had another target in his sights, Mark Malia, the right-hand man of the late Nikolai, the Russian Radev. Karl had learned that Malia was plotting revenge against him, but he saw an opportunity to extract valuable information about the Russians' drug supplies and cash reserves. On August 17, 2003, Karl and his men lured Malia into a house under the guise of a meeting. Once inside, they ambushed him, tying him to a chair in a garage. What followed was hours of brutal torture. They beat him with baseball bats, burned him with cigarettes, and used a soldering iron in an attempt to force him to reveal the location of the Russians' assets. But Malia refused to talk. Frustrated and enraged, Karl's men killed Malia, stuffed his body into a wheelie bin, and dumped it into a storm drain. They then set the bin on fire, hoping to destroy the evidence. But passers-by noticed the smoke rising from the drain and alerted the authorities. The grisly scene made headlines, further intensifying the police's focus on Karl. Meanwhile, in the criminal underworld, there was confusion about who had ordered the hit on Willie Thompson. Karl seized this opportunity to spread a rumor that the killer was a man named Michael Marshall, a kickboxer and hot dog stand owner. As the rumor spread, a bounty was placed on Michael's head. Carl, ever the opportunist, arranged for Michael's murder. On October 25, 2003, Michael Marshall was ambushed outside his South Yarra home. As he stepped out of his car, Carl's henchmen fired multiple rounds into him, killing him on his front lawn in front of his 5-year-old son. By this point, Carl Williams believed he was untouchable. He saw himself as the king of Melbourne's underworld, a man who could eliminate his enemies with impunity. But the police were closing in. They had begun linking Carl to the multiple murders, and he was now directly in their crosshairs. When Carl learned that detectives were closing in on him, he plotted to kill their lead investigator. But the police uncovered his plan, leading to his arrest on November 17, 2003. In a bizarre and uncharacteristic moment, Carl, known for his ruthless demeanor, broke down hysterically during his arrest. He cried, begged, and even wet himself. Despite this, the authorities lacked sufficient evidence to hold him. After a few days in custody, Carl was released. He left the police station with a renewed swagger, reportedly organizing a $200,000 celebration at Melbourne's Crown Casino. Carl Williams had become a household name, but not for the reasons he might have hoped. The murders he orchestrated, the alliances he shattered, and the chaos he unleashed had catapulted him into the national spotlight. But Carl wasn't content to be seen as a ruthless crime lord. Instead, he began crafting a new narrative, one where he was the victim. In interviews, Carl presented himself as a man wronged by police corruption. He claimed he had never been violent, painting himself as a misunderstood figure. When pressed about how he had amassed his fortune, Carl shrugged it off, saying he made his money gambling. It was a bold lie, but one he delivered with the charm and confidence that had always been his trademark. Meanwhile, tensions were brewing in Melbourne's criminal underworld. The older generation of criminals, those who had once ruled the streets, were growing increasingly furious with Carl's rise. Lewis Moran, who had already lost his 2 sons, Mark and Jason, to Carl's hitmen, was consumed by grief and rage. He wanted revenge. Lewis found an ally in Graham, the monster Cora, a fellow gang leader who had also grown tired of Carl's growing influence. The 2 men met to discuss how they could deal with Carl once and for all. But Carl had eyes and ears everywhere. He soon learned of their plans and decided to strike first. On December 13, 2003, Carl's trusted hitman, Benji Veniamin, along with another gunman, ambushed Graham outside his home. The attack was swift and brutal. Graham was fatally shot, his life extinguished in a hail of bullets. But the underworld is a place of constant retaliation. Lewis Moran and his gang tracked Benji down to a hideout and killed him with his own gun. For Carl, this was a devastating blow. Benji had been more than just a hitman. He had been Carl's closest ally, his right-hand man. Carl's thirst for revenge only grew stronger. On March 31, 2004, Lewis Moran was at his usual drinking spot, the Brunswick Club Hotel, with his bodyguard, Herbert Rout. At 6:40 p.m., 2 of Carl's masked gunmen stormed the venue. Chaos erupted. Lewis attempted to flee, scrambling over a poker machine and crashing through a glass window. But one of the gunmen caught up to him. 2 shots rang out, striking Lewis in the back of the head. He was dead before he hit the ground. Herbert, the bodyguard, was also shot but miraculously survived the attack. Carl wasn't done yet. He ordered a hit on Mario Condello, a prominent lawyer who represented several of his rivals. But this time, the police were one step ahead. They learned of the plot and moved quickly to stop it. On June 9, 2004, Carl was arrested for conspiracy to murder. It was the beginning of the end for the self-proclaimed king of Melbourne's underworld. He was eventually found guilty of drug trafficking charges and sentenced on October 29, 2004, to 7 years in prison. But the police weren't finished. They continued to build their case against Carl, convicting several of his henchmen in connection to the murder of Michael Marshall. In a plea deal, these men provided information about Carl's role in the killing. On July 19, 2006, Carl Williams was sentenced to 26 years in prison for the murder of Michael Marshall. With Carl locked up, his empire began to crumble. His men, once fiercely loyal, started to turn on him. They ratted him out, providing the police with the evidence they needed to charge Carl with the murders of Louis, Jason, and Mark Moran. On February 26, 2007, Carl was formally charged, and on May 7, 2007, he was given a minimum term of 35 years imprisonment. At 36 years old, Carl would have to wait until he was 71 before he could even be considered for release. But that day would never come. Carl was imprisoned in Barwon Prison, a high-security facility. For a man who had once ruled Melbourne's underworld, life behind bars was a stark contrast. But even in prison, Carl couldn't escape the violence he had spent his life perpetuating. On April 19, 2010, Carl was seated at a table in the prison unit, casually flipping through a magazine. Unbeknownst to him, tensions were simmering nearby. A fellow inmate, Matthew Johnson, had been harboring resentment toward Carl. The exact motive remains unclear. Some say it was due to Carl's cooperation with police, while others claim it was a personal dispute. What happened next was captured on the unit's security cameras. Matthew had detached the stem of an exercise bike, a hefty piece of metal. As Carl sat reading, Matthew approached him from behind. Without warning, he swung the steel bar with brutal force, striking Carl on the head. Carl collapsed, but Matthew wasn't done. He stood over the once notorious gangster and delivered several more blows to his head, ensuring Carl wouldn't survive. By the time prison guards rushed into the unit, Carl was already dead. Blood pooled around him as he lay slumped over the table, the magazine still open in front of him. The attack was so brutal that Carl's skull was cracked open. His death sparked widespread outrage and scrutiny. How could such a high-profile inmate be killed in a high-security prison? Matthew Johnson showed no remorse. He later claimed he acted in self-defense, but in 2011, he was convicted of Carl's murder and sentenced to life in prison. The story of Carl Williams is a grim reminder of the sheer brutality of the criminal underworld. A man who rose to power through violence and fear met his end in the same way. His life and death serve as a cautionary tale about the cost of revenge, the fragility of power, and the inescapable consequences of a life lived in the shadows. What lessons can we take from Carl's rise and fall? And what does his story tell us about the nature of crime and justice? These are questions that linger long after the final chapter of the Gangland War was written.